Dear viewers, imagine a giant force silently swallowing the ocean without a single gunshot, just with disguised ships quietly advancing, then suddenly everything reverses. The invader is swallowed by its own scheme, causing the entire region to erupt in an unexpected counterattack. This is the dark secret unfolding in the South China Sea, where China's once dominant gray zone strategy has now become a deadly burden, pushing Beijing into comprehensive isolation. China once believed that a strategy without firing a single bullet could bring the entire South China Sea under its control. This is what is called the gray zone strategy. They do not declare war, but still infiltrate, threaten, and impose their presence at hotspots. Fishing boats are shielded with steel. Maritime militias disguise themselves as fishermen. Coast Guard ships are equipped with water cannons and powerful lasers. Beijing deploys hundreds of such units daily across the Southeast Asian seas, sending a clear message: we are here, and this is our territory. But after more than a decade of testing, this strategy is gradually losing effectiveness. Not only has China failed to gain more territory, but it has also been encircled by a new alliance network among the US, Japan, India, Australia, and ASEAN countries. The tactic of silent warfare has now become the reason China loses legitimacy, allies, and control. Could it be that by trying to win without fighting, Beijing has fallen into the trap it created? Dear viewers, please join me, Than Tao from the Global Panorama Channel, to explore this deeper. In today's video, we will reveal layer by layer the analyses and schemes China has applied in the South China Sea for nearly 2 decades. From Scarborough Shoal to Second Thomas Shoal, from ocean drilling rigs to maritime militia disguised as fishermen. But more importantly, we will decode why the gray zone strategy is no longer effective and who is leading the regional response. Now let's enter the first part, where we witness the collapse of an empire once thought invincible. But wait, dear viewers, did you know that those disguised ships are digging their own graves, turning Beijing from predator into prey in this deadly chess game? On the current strategic map, the South China Sea is no longer China's solo stage. The US is back. Japan and India have joined the game. The Philippines does not back down. Indonesia is not silent. Malaysia is gradually asserting its central position. The game no longer revolves around what China will seize, but how much Beijing can still hold. The gray zone strategy has turned from an advantage into Achilles' heel. Since 2012, China has deployed a series of below-conflict threshold activities to gradually control the South China Sea. They do not declare war, but use fake fishing boats. The Coast Guard is armed. Geological survey ships are accompanied by protection forces, all coordinated under a model of fishermen protected by police, who are supported by the military. This strategy is called gray zone, neither peace nor war. The goal is to change the status quo without paying the price of war. But each piece of this scheme is being destroyed for a simple reason. Regional countries are no longer afraid. Collisions and counterattacks are increasingly frequent. In 2012, China sent ships to Scarborough Shoal within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Facing strong opposition, clashes, and media exposure, Beijing withdrew earlier than planned. In 2019, the Haiyang Diji 8 geological survey ship, along with escort vessels, intruded into the Natuna Islands, an Indonesian-Russian oil and gas cooperation area. After nearly 4 months of confrontation with Indonesia, openly sharing all AIS data and satellite images, attracting condemnation from the US, EU, and the international community, China withdrew without achieving its goal. By 2023, the Philippines became the main target in Beijing's new pressure campaign. Warships, militia boats, water cannons, lasers, and sonic waves were all used to block supplies at Second Thomas Shoal. But they failed. The Philippines publicly coordinated patrols with the US, Japan, and Australia, successfully resupplying by inflatable boats despite threats with knives. Each incident proves that China's gray zone strategy only works when the opponent remains silent. Once the opposition is organized and images are exposed internationally, Beijing falls into isolation again. The ASEAN defense line is becoming clearly formed, no longer just sporadic reactions. Now every action by China encounters a defensive reflex system. The Philippines openly exposes this through satellite media. Indonesia deploys its navy at Natuna. Malaysia strengthens control and prepares international legal documentation. Malaysia continues drilling for oil at Kasawari, despite pressure from outside ASEAN. The United States, Japan, India, and Australia have participated through joint exercises and technical defense support agreements. The more China intensifies pressure, the more reason the opposing side has to unite. This is the strategic paradox that Beijing has yet to resolve. Indonesia's role in the current chessboard. Indonesia does not declare a military alliance, but gradually strengthens its capabilities, from the Natuna drilling rig to escorting drilling ships to overcome harassment from Chinese Coast Guard vessels. From diplomatic protests to publicly presenting images of violations to the United Nations, Indonesia demonstrates a strategy of protecting sovereignty through steadfast legal enforcement power. It does not engage in an arms race, but does not retreat an inch of sea territory. This is the response model inspiring Malaysia and the Philippines. The chessboard has turned, putting Beijing on the defensive. Since 2024, each month China has deployed more than 200 militia and Coast Guard vessels into the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. But the effect is almost zero. All are filmed and photographed and reported to the United Nations. Instead of gaining more territory, China becomes further isolated. Meanwhile, the United States conducts joint training with Japan and the Philippines, and India supplies hypersonic missiles to Manila. The EU issues firm statements. And even ASEAN, though not yet in full agreement, is no longer the silent bloc it was a decade ago. China remains present but cannot control the situation. This is the current chessboard where the gray zone strategy is no longer an offensive weapon, but has become Beijing's strategic weakness. Do you dare to believe that behind this persistence lies a terrifying secret that makes Beijing unable to stop, even knowing it is self-destructing? Keep reading to discover more. Why does China persist in pursuing the gray zone tactic despite knowing it will fail? What hidden interests lie behind it? And what makes Beijing willing to strain itself to hold the South China Sea battlefield, regardless of diplomatic reputation losses? A big question for the whole region is, if the gray zone strategy is collapsing, if ASEAN countries are becoming increasingly tough, and the U.S. is tightening its encirclement, why does Beijing still not retreat? On the contrary, they increase the number of maritime militia vessels, expand island reclamation, and increase patrol frequency to occupy and provoke. So, where is the real strategic motive? A front line that cannot be lost. The South China Sea is the key to survival. Chinese policymakers always regard the South China Sea as the throat-controlling energy imports, maritime trade, the strategic southern corridor, along with ambitions to control global supply chains. According to a report by the CSIS Center in Washington in June 2025, nearly one-third of global commercial goods pass through the South China Sea annually. Just a slight blockade order from the U.S., Japan, or Australia at choke points like the Malacca Strait would immediately choke China's economy. Therefore, the South China Sea is not just a sovereignty dispute zone. It is China's survival wall in an era of strategic encirclement. The gray zone strategy is a control tool without declaring war. According to research by scholar Oriana Schuyler Mastro of Stanford University, Beijing does not believe it can win a full-scale war with the U.S. in the Pacific. Instead, it gnaws step by step through tactics such as unarmed fishing boats disguised as militia, armed Coast Guard vessels that do not fire, Survey ships accompanied by escort vessels declaring new maritime laws, imposing buoys, occupying shoals, reclaiming islands, and turning the status quo into legal reality. The goal is not to immediately seize the entire South China Sea, but to create incremental realities that push regional countries into acceptance. The gray zone strategy is a way to change geopolitics without giving reasons for a full military response. Beijing's miscalculation is underestimating ASEAN's resistance. The problem is, China misjudged the strategic resilience of ASEAN countries. They once believed the Philippines would not dare to confront long-term due to trade dependence, that the Philippines would always have a soft president like Duterte, that Indonesia was too passive, Malaysia too weak, and that Laos and Cambodia would be able to silence ASEAN in any tough statements. But reality is completely different. The Philippines changed its president and its stance. Indonesia quietly prepared legal dossiers and built maritime enforcement forces. Indonesia not only deployed warships, but also sent its president to Natuna to affirm sovereignty. Malaysia quietly expanded new drilling wells at the Luconia Shoal. China cannot believe that a region once deeply divided is now shaping a regional defense formation. Geopolitical interests outweigh diplomatic risks. Nevertheless, Beijing still does not give up the gray zone, because stopping would mean admitting strategic failure on one of the three most important fronts: the South China Sea, Taiwan, and Tibet. Admitting failure in the South China Sea would not only lose economic interests, but also lose prestige across the region, especially in the eyes of observing countries like Pakistan, Iran, or potential allies in Africa and Central Asia. According to an analysis by Nikkei Asia on July 18, 2025, security experts believe China has no withdrawal strategy in the South China Sea. They only have two choices: either hold on or lose face completely. That is why even when the gray zone strategy backfires, Beijing still maintains it, because it is the only scenario they have to avoid open confrontation and delay defeat. China also has internal turmoil and lacks the capacity to shift strategies. A rarely mentioned factor is that the Beijing leadership apparatus itself is falling into strategic fragmentation. After many internal purges in the military and diplomacy, the decision-making apparatus in Beijing now struggles to reach consensus on alternative strategies. According to the South China Morning Post, a series of senior officers in the Chinese Coast Guard were replaced for being considered too soft in response to clashes with the Philippines. This shows that instead of reassessing the effectiveness of the gray zone, Beijing blames the executors for lacking decisiveness. This is a vicious cycle of internal politics, causing China not to change its strategy despite clear failures. In summary, Beijing does not abandon the gray zone not because it is still effective, but because there is no viable alternative to maintain pressure and avoid full-scale military escalation. But this leads to even more serious consequences. ASEAN countries and the world are beginning to change their perspective from passive to actively confronting and building new alliances to isolate China. Prepare for a major shock because this very persistence is triggering a deadly alliance that could permanently sink Beijing. How are ASEAN, the US, Japan, and allied countries redrawing the map of resistance against China in the South China Sea? Who is proactively pulling the front line forward? When China thought it could gradually dominate the South China Sea through the gray zone strategy, they did not expect that pressure to spur the formation of a new alliance. This alliance does not require binding treaties or NATO-style collective defense clauses, but remains effective in every reaction, every ship deployment, every exposure of the truth. And importantly, it does not come from one side alone. Not only the US, but Japan, India, Australia, the EU, and ASEAN members have changed their approach. The US has moved from observation to leading the expansion of the front line. During President Trump's first term, freedom of navigation patrols increased, with aircraft carriers and reconnaissance planes regularly entering the South China Sea. By the second term, the situation changed completely. The U.S. no longer patrols alone. They conduct joint training, build rotating bases, and sign a series of defense support agreements with Southeast Asian countries. With the Philippines, the expanded EDCA agreement activated 4 new military bases. U.S. warships frequently appear at Reed Bank with Indonesia. The U.S. sells defense equipment, transfers surveillance radars, cooperates in training maritime law enforcement forces, and recently negotiated to expand air defense supply chains. With Indonesia and Malaysia, the U.S. supports early warning software, provides P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft, and deploys maritime data sharing centers. This presence is not for attack, but to remind China that the South China Sea is not a backyard and that every coercive act has witnesses. Japan has shifted from financial support to strategic support. Japan does not have direct disputes in the South China Sea, but understands that if Beijing controls the South China Sea, Japan's vital trade routes would also be in China's hands. Therefore, Japan has made a historic shift. In July 2024, Japan and the Philippines signed a mutual access agreement. Japan transferred 6 Abukuma-class frigates to the Philippine Navy, supported Indonesia with high-speed patrol boats, trained naval officers alongside the U.S., and organized the Freedom Edge exercises in the eastern South China Sea. According to Nikkei, Tokyo is considering connecting defense networks in the East China Sea and South China Sea, turning the southern waters of Okinawa into a coordinated transit point for Southeast Asia. India has shifted its confrontation from the Himalayas to the South China Sea. India once focused all its forces on the Himalayan border, but after many bloody clashes and Beijing's expansionist policies, New Delhi decided to strike China from another direction. It signed a strategic partnership agreement with the Philippines, supplied BrahMos supersonic missiles and coastal defense systems capable of destroying Chinese warships within minutes, and conducted joint exercises in the South China Sea in April 2025. Placing the Philippines on the priority list in the defense cooperation chain. India also openly supports the 2016 PCA ruling, rejecting China's 9-dash line, a clear diplomatic counterbalance. Australia and the EU are new factors creating comprehensive spatial pressure. Australia, as a Quad member, has deployed frigates to participate in multinational patrols in the South China Sea. Additionally, Canberra provides submarine detection equipment, maritime data, and satellite surveillance sharing to the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. The European Union, although lacking military forces in the region, exerts the strongest legal and diplomatic pressure on China. The EU openly declares that China's sovereignty claims violate international law and threaten freedom of navigation. Over 20 European countries participate in the Global Maritime Monitoring System, providing AIS data and satellite images to help smaller countries expose Beijing's actions. ASEAN's divisions are gradually fading. For many years, Cambodia and Laos were seen as ASEAN's blockers, always vetoing strong statements on the South China Sea. But from 2024, everything changed. Under Hun Manet, Cambodia no longer speaks for Beijing and even calls on China to de-escalate in the South China Sea to avoid affecting the regional investment environment. Laos, though quiet, does not oppose recent ASEAN joint statements condemning the use of militia ships in disputed areas. Countries like Singapore and Thailand, though not disputing, have begun participating in exercises, monitoring maritime zones, and even proposing the establishment of a joint ASEAN Operational Response Center. Although ASEAN does not yet have a unified military alliance, each country is establishing its own strategic defense lines, drawing closer with the security networks of the U.S., Japan, and India. From a divided region manipulated through political investment, ASEAN is gradually becoming an organized resistance bloc, quiet but effective. But can you imagine that behind these alliances are secret counterattacks that could cause Beijing to collapse in the blink of an eye? Each ASEAN country, from the Philippines to Indonesia, from Indonesia to Malaysia, has responded in its own way. Some only play defense, while others actively push the front line farther away. The South China Sea is no longer a place where only China dominates. Each ASEAN country has now chosen its own way of reacting, a unique strategy depending on their position, interests, and the situation they are drawn into. Whereas previously regional responses were fragmented, cautious, and passive, now the countermeasures are continuous and strategically purposeful. The Philippines openly formed an alliance for direct confrontation. The Philippines, being the country under the most direct pressure from China, has also been the most proactive in its response. Under President Marcos, Manila's strategy no longer involves endless dialogue, but publicizes all acts of coercion, signs multilateral defense alliances, and increases on-the-ground presence through the Coast Guard. The case of the BRP Sierra Madre ship at 2nd Thomas Shoal is a typical example. China blockaded the supply route, using water cannons and laser weapons to threaten. But the Philippines did not back down, using inflatable boats and coordinating with the US, Japan, and Australia to complete resupply right under the siege. Moreover, the Philippines signed the RAA with Japan, security agreements with Canada and New Zealand, and joined the informal Quad alliance of the US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Within 2 years, Manila transformed itself into the main center of resistance in the South China Sea. Indonesia is legally resilient, not loud, but determined. Unlike the Philippines, Indonesia does not flaunt alliances, but is the strongest law enforcement country in the South China Sea. It has clashed with Chinese vessels at the Natuna Islands, protested diplomatically, combined with sending international diplomatic notes, prepared legal dossiers, built patrol capabilities, asserted sovereignty, and expanded cooperation in oil and gas exploitation with Russia, Spain, and India. Especially since 2021, Indonesia has continuously exposed incursions at Natuna through satellite images and AIS data publicly shared with international media. Although it does not have a defense alliance, Indonesia uses 3 pillars: internal strength, legality, and truth, to firmly maintain its strategic space. No need for noise, but not yielding even 1 nautical mile. Indonesia proactively confronts to protect its resources. Indonesia was once seen as an outsider in the South China Sea dispute. But since 2020, everything has changed. Beijing infringed on the exclusive economic zone at Natuna. President Joko Widodo personally went to the fleet to inspect and deployed naval ships close to China. Immediately after, plans were made to increase patrols, upgrade military bases, and invite the US and Japan to cooperate in surveillance. Indonesia also began extracting gas at the tuna field, despite being surrounded by Chinese Coast Guard vessels. The operation was completed on schedule. This move proved that China no longer has the ability to prevent other countries from exploiting maritime resources. Indonesia does not need to be loud, but every step it takes carries strategic weight. Malaysia is quiet, but uncompromising. Malaysia was harassed the most at the Luconia Shoals from 2018 to 2022, with China continuously pressuring to prevent Malaysia from drilling oil. But Petronas, the national oil company, still managed to drill 25 wells in 2023 and plans to drill 15 new wells in 2024. The Malaysian government does not disclose much, but the data speaks for itself. Oil and gas activities continue despite threats. Malaysia chooses a strategy of development without retreat, focusing on realizing sovereignty through increased resource exploitation.
Singapore, Thailand, and Brunei are strategically neutral but not indifferent. Singapore does not dispute sovereignty, but is concerned about freedom of navigation. The country has proposed an ASEAN Maritime Security Coordination Center and participates in sharing early warning radar data with the US and Japan. Thailand, an unofficial ally of China, maintains a pragmatic neutral stance. Although it does not openly criticize Beijing, Bangkok still allows the US access to military bases during regional exercises. Brunei remains silent but continues to dispute maritime claims quietly, accepting surveillance equipment from the UK and the US. These three countries have not actively counterattacked, but no longer side with China as before. Cambodia and Laos show signs of cracks within Beijing's circle of influence. In previous years, Beijing used Cambodia and Laos as diplomatic shields to prevent ASEAN from issuing strong joint statements. Laos has not completely changed, but no longer acts as a wall blocking ASEAN as before. This indicates that China's political grip within ASEAN is fracturing from within. But dear viewers, prepare yourselves because the next part will reveal a terrible secret. If China does not stop, it could ignite a real war that would engulf the entire region in flames. When gray zone tactics are neutralized, will Beijing escalate confrontation or strategically retreat? Will ASEAN maintain relative unity or become divided? The chessboard is still shifting, and the battle lines are not closed. When gray zone strategies fail and the opponent is unafraid, what will China do next? This is the key question now because Beijing is not only tactically disadvantaged, but also risks diplomatic isolation. Scenario 1. Limited escalation, shifting from gray zone to black zone. In an internal report by the Chinese Defense Research Institute in early 2025, some experts proposed controlled escalation, using low-level force to pressure regional countries to accept Beijing's soft control boundaries. What does this mean? Armed Coast Guard vessels are allowed to fire warning shots. Maritime militia boats are equipped with stun guns and rubber bullets. Small warships approach closely to create de facto exclusion zones. Non-lethal attack drones are deployed. Devices are installed to blind radars and jam GPS in disputed areas. The goal is to create a sense of dominance without being accused of waging war, turning the gray zone into a darker gray zone near the black zone. But if China takes this path, it will pay a high price. There is a risk of triggering regional defense treaties. An act crossing the threshold, such as firing warning shots or causing injuries, could immediately activate the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. According to the U.S. Secretary of State's statement at the recent ASEAN summit, any deliberate attack on Philippine armed forces in disputed areas will be considered an act of war against the United States. The same could happen if Indonesia presents evidence of deliberate attacks on its law enforcement forces. Meanwhile, Japan, Australia, India, and the EU are ready to speak out and deploy forces if the U.S. intervenes. This geopolitical domino effect could erupt from just an excessive water cannon spray. Scenario 2. A step back to soft control. Another option considered by China's foreign ministry is withdrawing armed vessels from hotspots, switching to legal patrols with oceanographic research ships, placing warning buoys citing environmental protection, regularly sending diplomatic protest notes but taking no real action, strengthening domestic propaganda, and creating an image of China as a peacekeeper, shifting from coercion at sea to legal and media debate. This scenario helps Beijing ease international pressure and somewhat save face domestically. However, if this path is chosen, China is seen as quietly defeated. More dangerously, regional countries could use this time to push the front lines forward. Scenario 3. Behind-the-scenes deals dividing the South China Sea into zones of interest. A strategic bargaining approach is for China to negotiate bilaterally with each country, proposing resource exploitation and sharing economic benefits according to specific ratios, committing to reduce clashes in exchange for diplomatic silence, or suggesting investment cooperation in undisputed waters, in exchange for concessions in disputed areas. This is a model of dividing the chessboard to exclude the US and Japan, and isolate ASEAN countries one by one. In fact, China has tried this with Malaysia, Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos. However, public opposition from the Philippines, silent resistance from Indonesia, and Malaysia's sudden change of stance have made bilateral deals ineffective as Beijing hoped. Scenario 4. Expanding tactics beyond the South China Sea to create new fronts and reduce pressure. If unsuccessful in the South China Sea, China shifts the strategic battlefield elsewhere, dispersing U.S. and allied forces and opening new pressure fronts to force ASEAN to back down. Specifically, Beijing increases pressure on Taiwan, expands the ADIAZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, heightens tensions in the Bashi Channel connecting the South China Sea to the Pacific, triggers covert clashes near Japan's Senkaku Islands, shifts some Coast Guard vessels to the East China Sea, weakening coordination among Japan, the U.S., and the Philippines. All these moves aim to change the battlefield to cool tensions, a classic tactic of a great power forced into defense. But the risk of too many fronts could exhaust China faster than expected. The likelihood of China changing strategy is very low. According to expert Hun Tam-sang's analysis in the East Asia Forum magazine in July 2025, China's institutional nature makes it difficult to change a failing strategy, especially when deeply embedded in military propaganda systems. This means Beijing's chance of a complete retreat is very low. China may reduce intensity, change form or location, but the essence is to continue pushing the South China Sea into prolonged tension. But do you know that behind these scenarios lies a harsh truth that could collapse the entire chessboard in an instant? In the final part, we summarize how China's gray zone strategic chessboard collapses. Will ASEAN maintain the current formation? Is the South China Sea confrontation truly an isolated game, or the opening of a long-term strategic war across the region? After nearly 2 decades of implementing gray zone strategy, China has gained some local benefits, but failed in long-term goals. Beijing wants to turn the South China Sea into a default control zone, but currently it faces a chain of reactions, from ASEAN, global allies, from unilateralism to multilateral confrontation. Previously, any clash in the South China Sea was quietly resolved or stopped at diplomatic protests. Now, every coercive Chinese action is publicly recorded and spread, brought to international forums with on-the-ground responses from the US, Japan, India, and Australia. This completely changes the nature of the game. The South China Sea is no longer a bilateral bargaining game, but a global strategic confrontation. ASEAN has moved from division to conditional confidence. Not all ASEAN countries are united, but compared to a decade ago, the change is clear. The Philippines has shifted from soft to tough. Indonesia maintains a principle of not yielding an inch of sea. Indonesia and Malaysia actively exploit resources despite harassment. Cambodia and Laos have begun to move away from absolute defense of Beijing. This confidence does not come from individual military strength, but from the belief that they are not alone, backed by a network of great powers ready to support. Whether China holds or loses ground, the South China Sea is one of 3 strategic battlefields for Beijing, along with Taiwan and the India-China border. Losing ground in the South China Sea strikes directly at domestic political prestige and signals to other opponents that China is being pushed back. Therefore, China is unlikely to fully retreat. It continues low-level pressure and high presence to prolong the situation, hoping some regional countries will tire and return to bilateral negotiations. But this is a trap because the longer it drags on, the stronger the resistance alliance becomes. The U.S. and allies strengthen the strategic arc. The U.S., Japan, India, and Australia have completed a strategic arc from the Western Pacific to the Indian Ocean. The South China Sea, as a convergence point, is the main reason for maintaining a long-term military presence in the region. Each time China increases pressure, it gives more reason to expand military cooperation, arms sales, and intelligence sharing with ASEAN. Therefore, the South China Sea chessboard is no longer just a game among coastal countries, but a component of global power chess. The open question for the entire region is, can ASEAN persist in maintaining this relative unity when facing economic pressure from China? Are external great powers ready to intervene if clashes cross the threshold? And most importantly, will the South China Sea become the first armed conflict battlefield of this century, or a place where parties are forced to find a new coexistence model? If China's gray zone strategy reaches its limit, The next part will reveal the long-term race between Beijing's ability to maintain pressure and the opponent's ability to maintain unity. Whoever tires first loses. Dear viewers, which side do you think will blink first? Please comment below, like, share, and subscribe to the Global Panorama channel so you don't miss the next video from Mr. Jack.